Okay, so how's everybody doing? So we didn't cover chapter 1 and 2 in class. This is something that we're just going to kind of do on the outside of class. A few quick items here. This is kind of how I'll kind of present some of these lectures before you actually see them in class. So I'll start with chapter 1. So when you read through chapter 1, which we're probably not going to do, it kind of sets kind of the stage about some of the main areas that are focused in biology, from hierarchy of organization through environmental interactions, evolution, scientific inquiry, and the like. So one of the things that we'll talk about throughout the course of the year, and you'll see this, we'll talk about how there's a hierarchy or a kind of a level of or sequence levels that happen in biology. The simplest thing we're seeing now, we're actually talking currently about some chemistry. So we're going to talk about atoms, and then we'll talk about more complex biological molecules such as lipids, carbs, proteins, nucleic acids. We'll talk about how those things then build to make organelles and cells and tissue and so on and so forth. But there'll always be this focus on simple to complex. We'll do the same thing with, we won't get into this too much. We'll do a little bit of ecology. This is more of an environmental science kind of topic, but we'll talk about populations, communities, and ecosystems. We'll talk about how there are interactions between how if you remove one organism from an ecosystem, it can have a major impact somewhere else. Another thing we'll talk about is cell types. So this whole idea that all living things are made from cells. We'll get into the idea of prokaryotic versus eukaryotic cells. You probably know a little bit about this from your time in honors bio, but we'll spend a little bit more time on that as well this year. The big difference that you'll see as we make these kind of connections is that prokaryotic cells are super simple. For our purposes, they're bacteria, things without a nucleus. Outside of that, all other cells will have a nucleus, which include protozoa, fungus, plants, and animals, which are 4 of our 6 kingdoms, which once again we'll get into more depth as we kind of go through the course of the year. We'll talk about this idea of continuity. So there's this idea that like things beget like things, meaning that if you're a turtle, you're going to give birth to more turtles, or if you're a chicken, you'll give birth to more chicken. The idea is that we pass on our genetic code from one generation to the next, and there's some mechanics behind how that happens. There's some mechanics behind how the code's copied and passed along. There are errors that can take place along the way, and we'll discuss those once again in more subsequent chapters. The other piece we'll talk about is the idea of how shape dictates how things work. You're actually already starting to see this now. We're talking about atoms. We talked about carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and the shape of these molecules dictates how they work. For example, tomorrow in class we'll be talking about how oxygen's always a big fat guy and is stealing electrons from others. You'll see that in class tomorrow. This is chapter 2 in a nutshell. These will be the topics that we'll discuss. Currently we're doing atoms and compounds, or atoms and elements. We've got into atomic number, atomic mass. We haven't talked isotopes yet. That'll be as we move on a little bit. We will get into we've talked a little about energy levels, which are the orbits. We talked about what those look like. It's very simple in this diagram. You can see your protons and neutrons are in the center, or the nucleus, and then your electrons are kind of zipping around the outside. All right, not a great diagram as far as kind of what we've drawn in class, but anyway, kind of goes along with what we're doing. So there's this understanding you have to have of chemistry that it's important in biology because all living things are made of atoms, made of compounds, made of molecules. So you have to understand how these things work in order to better understand how some biological systems work. Once again, we talked about the first 20 or so on the periodic table. There are about 25 molecules that are important to life. The first 20 tend to be really important ones. There are a few outside the first 20, like iron and iodine and things like that also show up in biological systems, but we'll get into more of that. Once again, here are the big 4, C, O, H, and N. We talked about how carbon makes 4 bonds, nitrogen makes 3, oxygen makes 2, and hydrogen makes 1. Super important for later on. Currently, this is kind of where we are now. We're in the process now of talking about different types of bonds. Covalent, double covalent, nonpolar covalent, polar covalent, ionic, hydrogen, and van der Waals. There are a few more on here that we won't actually really discuss too much. For example, van der Waals is, we'll talk about that kind of limited. The biggies here are covalent, polar, covalent, ionic, and hydrogen. Those are probably the big four. So covalent bonds are pretty straightforward. We had this conversation in class about adjacent or elements that are side by side will share electrons in pairs, and the idea of the sharing pairs of electrons allows each atom to then fill its outer or valence shell. If we have a couple examples here, first one is hydrogen right here. We have oxygen, we have water, and we have methane. We've actually done, we've looked at water, we've looked at methane, haven't looked at oxygen, hydrogen yet. The idea is, though, you can see where there's this overlap of electrons. Okay. What's interesting is that the electrons normally in covalent bonds, ideally they're shared equally. In the case of hydrogen, they're shared equally because each hydrogen atom has the same mass, so neither one is pulling more on the electron than any other one is. Oxygen, same thing. We have two identical atoms here of oxygen. Each one is going to share those electrons similarly. And you can notice that this would be a single bond, or one pair of electrons. This would be a double bond. Here's a pair of electrons here and a pair there. When we look at carbon, carbon's friendly in some respects. Carbon always makes covalent bonds, meaning that they always share equally with all atoms that they bond with. There's a number of reasons for that, but if you think of it this way, here we have this carbon atom in the middle, and there's four hydrogens playing tug of war. No one's really winning. Everybody's just kind of staying right there in the same general area. Oxygen, on the other hand, anytime oxygen pairs up with anyone besides itself, it tends to make what they call polar covalent bonds. The idea of a polar covalent bond is you have one molecule, in this case oxygen, which is much larger than hydrogen. When that happens, the electrons that they're shared between oxygen and hydrogen, the difference though is that they're shared unequally. So the electron, one of the two electrons, gets pulled closer to oxygen than it does to hydrogen, causing this negative effect, or this slightly negative effect on one side, which would be the oxygen side, and a slightly positive on the other side. We'll talk more about this in class. You'll see we'll have some examples there as well. So covalent bonds, they come in three forms: single, double, triple. We actually did this with a couple people dancing in class. We had people hold hands and show the spin. That was our single bond. We had people hold two hands, then they spun. That was a double bond. And then we showed triple bonding, which was, two hands and a foot. We also did this with the molecule kits as well. And you saw that single bonds were more flexible than double, which were more flexible than triple. All right, so once again, the shape dictates how they work. Double bonds will become really important when we start talking in chapter 4 and 5 about something called isomers. You've probably heard of a couple. For example, one isomer in particular that you've heard of a lot, probably in the news or just in your everyday life, is something called a trans fat, and we'll kind of discuss that more in class. Polar and nonpolar covalent bonds. So polar means that there are ends, meaning there are distinct sides of a molecule. Think of like the North and South Pole. There are ends of the Earth. Think about a magnet. It has a positive side and a negative side. Well, what happens here, this is a great diagram for this, is that this idea of electronegativity. So if we were to jump down inside of these atoms here, right? So we've got an oxygen, we have a hydrogen, we have a hydrogen. Oxygen has 8 protons. Hydrogen has 1 proton, hydrogen has 1 proton. We know that protons have a positive charge. So there's 8 positive charges in the center here, and 1 positive charge in the center here. If they're sharing an electron between the two of them, and by the way, this is just a space-filling model is what they call this. If they're sharing a pair of electrons, and that's what this blue arrow is supposed to represent, is the sharing of electrons, what's going to happen is the 8 positive protons inside the nucleus of the oxygen atom are going to pull the electron closer, because electrons are negatively charged. So these 2 electrons that are being shared between hydrogen and oxygen are pulled closer for a couple of reasons. One, due to the fact that oxygen has a stronger pull on electrons, has a stronger electronegativity, and the other thing is the mass. Remember, this guy's oxygen's we guess we're calling him a big fat guy. He's a mass of 16 as opposed to a mass of 1 for hydrogen. So in addition to the electrical pull, it also has that gravitational or mass pull that's pulling those electrons closer. In either event, you have these little symbols here. They look like an S that's kind of come back around on itself. It means slightly. What you end up with is 2 slightly negative sides on either side of the oxygen and 1 slightly positive side on either water molecule. I'm sorry, the hydrogen molecule. We're going to see this kind of in our lab that we're going to do in class. We're going to look at pennies and drop water on pennies and see how much water the penny will hold. And these slightly negative and slightly positive charges actually allow water to stick to itself, which is cohesion, and it also allows it to stick to other things, which is adhesion. Once again, we'll discuss this more during the lab tomorrow. Ionic bonds, we did the same example in class. We talked about the sodium chloride. So in the diagram here, we have sodium with its 2 on the inside, 8 on the next ring, 1 on the third ring. We have here's chlorine with its 2 on the inside ring, right there, 8 on the second ring, and 7 on the third ring. Chlorine needs to pick up 1 more to have a satisfied or full outer ring or valence shell, whereas sodium would have to pick up 7 electrons to fill that. So what happens is the molecule that's a little stronger in this sense, chlorine is going to be a little bit more electronegative because it's got more of those protons. It's going to actually pull the electron away from sodium. When this happens, sodium now has a full outer shell, even though it's only got 2 rings. It's still the outermost ring is full, which makes it unreactive with other atoms. And chlorine in the same boat. It picks up that extra electron. We talked about in class how if you lose something that's negative, you become positive, hence the +1. And if you gain something negative, you become more negative, hence the -1 or the minus charge. If you lost 2 things, you become +2. If you gain 2 things, you become -2. So you'll see, when we look at periodic trends, you're going to see that that first family or column are all -1. Second family or column is all -2. Third family is all -3, and so on and so forth. +1, +2, +3. Neutral will be carbon, and it'll go -3, -2, -1, neutral at the end. You'll see that as well in class. Hydrogen bonding, we haven't quite got to this yet. This will probably be the start of class tomorrow. The idea is that water molecules make these loose bonds between other molecules, and they're driven by hydrogens. And so what's happening here is we go back to that idea of that polar covalent bond. Here's our oxygen, here's our 2 hydrogens. Remember that oxygen's a big fat guy. It pulls the electrons a little further away, and as it pulls these electrons further away, the oxygen portion becomes slightly negatively charged, and the hydrogen portion becomes slightly positively charged. So you get this organization where it's oxygen to hydrogen, oxygen to hydrogen, oxygen to hydrogen, oxygen to hydrogen. You get these interactions through hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are super weak. They're made because hydrogen is almost always giving up its it's hard to explain this, but they're kind of giving away their electron, not completely, but they're giving away most of the control of the electron to bigger atoms such as oxygen, which creates these weak interactions, these hydrogen bonds. Super easy to break. They tend to be bonds including oxygen and hydrogen, or hydrogen and nitrogen. And you'll see those once again as we look at those in class. Van der Waals interactions, I'm going to skip this for right now. This is the basic idea is you create an area in a molecule that's attractive to other types of molecules, and we'll get into that once again during class. I think we're going to stop here. What we'll do is we'll kind of move on, talk a little bit more about chemical reactions. We'll talk a little bit, excuse me, more about how these bonds that are established then create larger molecules such as proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, nucleic acids. All right, hope this was helpful, and I'll see you in class.